I think it's a very relevant points that you make. I've just come back from a client today. I've been in Shuane for the whole week, and the environmental impact of one possible site there is quite substantial. There's a chlorine operation, and there's no effective emergency procedures in place whatsoever. So extremely topical in terms of the environmental risk. So what we're going to do now is just look at a few other areas that Aon could perhaps help its clients in the future in terms of the environmental risk. I think it's important to say I'm not qualified to do environmental impact assessments, such as possible impacts on flora and fauna. That requires a different set of skills that I haven't yet got. But there are a lot of areas in terms of that environmental concerns that we can address. And if we can just go on to the next slide, please. Oh, that's a terrible picture. Let's go on to the next one. So these are some of the areas we can look at. I don't know whether we'll have time to go through every single one in intense detail, but there are certain areas, and some of the case studies we're going to look at will show that they are of quite considerable concern. So again, if we could go on to the next one, please. And I think it's really important to say the reason as to why we're looking to help clients with environmental risk consulting. Everybody's seen some case studies that I'm sure you've heard of the case studies that we're going to go through, but I think people are tending to get more and more and more aware of what litigation risks there are. I think the media has by far covered the injury or death in terms of environmental catastrophes. The example I mentioned just now about the chlorine operation, if for any reason that operation failed, you'd have quite significant chlorine release to the immediate vicinity, and that's in a quite densely packed area. So it is important. We'll look at the case studies that will talk about the damage to company reputation, the loss of market share, and possible fines that in some cases stretch into the millions of dollars. But I think to reassure the client in each of these areas like solar, wind, hydro, asbestos, the advice we give, I'm confident that it's the most stringent that can be given, and that it reflects the country that the consulting is done in, and also reflects the wishes of the client. Say, for example, if I'm consulting and I'm picking any company at random, there's some say, for example, Coca-Cola or Pepsi, I'd make sure that it applies to the country that they're in, but also in terms of US regulations as they are exposed to US law should things go wrong. So it's important to state that. And the next slide, please. Again, it's very, very important to stress the legislation that we refer to. The reason we do that is that if ever there's an incident, any environmental catastrophe, we need to be able to prove that we've done all that we reasonably can in terms of controlling that risk. And again, the OSH Act is talking about South African legislation, but again, the Health and Safety at Work Act for the UK and the US also have very, very similar legislation. And these are just some key points. There is a duty of care for a safe working environment. There is a duty of care to eliminate any hazard or potential hazard. But it's also very, very important to say that non-employees shouldn't be exposed to the hazards. Again, this case of the chlorine gas, the non-employees would be the residents in the vicinity if ever there was a release. It could be a contractor that comes onto site and they're exposed to a possible chlorine release. And at the end of the day, the buck stops with the CEO. He has to assign duties to personnel in writing. So whether that's a safety rep, whether it's a emergency coordinator, whatever role is designated as necessary by the risk consultancy, he has to appoint it. and that the buck stops with him. And I think we're starting to realize that more and more in South Africa. Again, the next slide, please. I think it wise not to say who the oil company is, but this was probably the biggest environmental disaster, and it's got a lot of lessons for us in terms of the engineering space and also what Aon are looking to help our clients with. We'll go on to the next slide, please. This is the largest marine spill ever, 5 million barrels of oil. It works out at something like 780,000 cubic meters. I think from memory, it was one of the I think it was the biggest environmental impact ever worldwide. I think it exceeded Exxon Valdez oil tanker in 1987. And it's 11 people killed. Now, my background in law enforcement, I've had to deal with that. And even one person who's been killed is quite hard to deal with. But to deal with the multiple injuries, to deal with the multiple fatalities, that's a terrible burden to bear. But look at the cost implications. Look at the drop in market share. This particular company lost 40% of its market share. The government, where this happened, banned this company from contracts for the next 4 years. And as you can see, in terms of legal compliance, there's manslaughter charges. I think it's called culpable homicide in America, and possible obstruction of justice. But here's the interesting point. The direct cause, it says here, is a failure to monitor contracting operator. So in other words, the contractor risk. I think we could all think of cases where contractors have done something silly because they've not been monitored or they've not had effective permit to work systems to control that risk. Let's go on to the next one. This was going back a few years now, another major international oil company. You'll see the consequences for this one equally as severe. And the next slide, please. Here we have 168 people killed. I can well remember this when it came on the news. It was that big. As far as I can recall, the company where this happened, they're not trading anymore. I think 5 years later, I think it actually caused them to close. But again, it's looking at unsafe design. It talks about a rig here, but it could equally apply to any other client that we're operating with. And again, the direct cause was a failure to monitor a permit to work on a critical gas pump, which led to the explosion. And the next slide, please. Again, we see this is a major incident caused by a contractor hitting a gas pipeline. The contractor was doing digging works with the JCB and went through a 1 meter LP gas pipeline and caused, I think, 15, 16 fatalities. This was in the Low Countries in Europe. And the next slide, please. Again, we have some litigation here where a South African bank had to pay a 7-figure compensation. The workers were working in standard bank space, or was it ABSO? I can't remember which. They're working in that space in the 1970s, and because of the latency risks of asbestos, they were successfully prosecuted nearly 30 years later. And again, they didn't warn the contractors of the risk. We can also see silicosis lawsuits because South African mining companies are not warning their workers of the risks in the environment, because silicosis is a dust that can occur in concrete, it can occur in mining areas as well. So again, these are both environmental incidents. And then we go on to the next slide, please. Okay, so here's quite a bit more detail of the different areas where we can provide assistance to you. The petrochemical experience was gained with a major US oil company, and they were involved in that major incident that I illustrated just now. I'm not allowed to say who it is, but again, it's going into quite a bit of detail as to how we can advise the client in terms of petrochemical risk. to avoid any hydrocarbon release, to avoid possible impact of vessels onto the rigs, to avoid diving incidents, possible helicopter impacts. These are all different parts of the safety cases that an oil rig must have. And again, we can apply it to the online refineries, what we would call upstream in terms of petrochemical risk. Contractors, I'm extremely proud, I must say, to be the lead advisor on that injury-free project. It was again for a major US oil company. It was a construction project and we achieved 5 million man-hours injury-free. And that was quite an achievement. The project was 5 million man-hours. We didn't have a single injury on that site. And again, we're looking at trying to see if we can assist to the US and UK standards. If we have a client that wants advice to US and UK standards, then I'm extremely confident we can meet that requirement. Asbestos, the liability is 40 years. The definition of a competent person for a visual non-invasive survey is somebody who's aware of asbestos, who's got experience. It doesn't mean they have to be an approved asbestos inspection authority. That person is qualified to do actual air monitoring and to actually analyze the samples in a laboratory, to take the samples, to do a visual non-invasive survey. That is something that Aon is qualified to do. And again, in these different areas like solar power, hydro stations, geothermal, we always seek to apply the very, very best advice that we can. And indeed, for the hydro stations, as one example, the Development Bank of South Africa, one of the sponsors of this event, has produced some very, very good guidance. So when Aon have put together our standard operating procedures for all these different areas like solar, wind, hydro, etc., etc., I've acknowledged that Development Bank of South Africa have given some very good advice. And these SOPs, we make them available to clients to give them simple instructions as to how to deal with different risks. And the next slide, please. Again, wind turbine failures, wind power is starting to produce a significant amount of energy. But as you can see, there's a lot of fuel in there. There's a lot of combustible components. And indeed, when we're looking at wind power, we're also looking at the risk of possible cracking of the structure and possible damage to the surrounding area because of wind turbine failures. And the next slide, please. Again, I don't think I'm going into too much details here because we are mindful of time. PCBs, under South African legislation, they have to be completely outlawed by 2023. Aquaculture is a growing area where we advise in terms of abalone and salmon farms. And sewage plants is not the most glamorous, but there is quite a considerable risk in terms of possible hydrogen sulfide, combustible dust risk, and confined spaces. So these are all different areas where we've had a lot of exposure to the US and UK and South African standards. The next slide, please. Okay, so yes, Aon is here to help. I take so much pride in saying to a client, I'm not just doing a report and seeing you in 2 years' time. I really enjoy it when the client phones up and says, Andy, we have a concern. What can you help us with? And as we mentioned, standard operating procedures drafted by Aon, including relevant legislation, such as PCB regulations 2014 for PCBs. Looking at asbestos, we would go to the NFPA as well in America to include their material. And this is so important in terms of the induction materials, the safety meetings, the posters, the logbooks, and the permits to work. It's proof that if ever you need it, that you're complying as much as you can with the legislation, and that if ever there's an incident, you'd never be in a position where you'd be possibly prosecuted, as was the case with that example just now. And the next slide, please. Stop work authority is extremely important. We would urge all our clients to ensure that any worker with a concern on safety has the right to stop work. This is something that we provide training and instruction to the client, but it's critical. We can give advice to the client, but it also needs the client to commit to enable its workers to use stop work authority. I think it's very important when we arrive on site, treat the client with respect, because then they tend more to listen to your advice and apply it in the future, and obviously reduce the risk of an incident that we then have to pay for, possibly. But it's very, very important to get the client to commit to stop work authority.